I am not sitting next to her. Get this woman out of my sight right now." The words exploded through the first-class cabin before the aircraft door had even sealed shut. They hit like shattered glass, sharp and cutting, echoing off polished wood panels and cream leather seats that cost more than most people's cars. A champagne flute froze halfway to a businessman's lips. Someone's briefcase snapped shut too loudly. The gentle hum of the aircraft's auxiliary power seemed to hold its breath. Brenda Morrison stood rigid in the narrow aisle, her manicured finger extended like a weapon, aimed directly at seat 1A. Her knuckles were white around the handle of a Hermes bag that could have paid for a year of college tuition. Her breathing came fast and shallow, the controlled fury of someone who had spent 48 years bending the world to her will through sheer volume and financial leverage. Her target sat calmly in the window seat, a paperback novel open in her lap. Victoria Hayes didn't look up immediately. She turned another page with deliberate slowness, her expression serene behind reading glasses that had seen better decades. A simple navy cardigan draped over her shoulders. Gray slacks, sensible flats, silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. No jewelry except a thin watch at her wrist that had stopped keeping perfect time years ago. To most observers, she appeared unremarkable, forgettable even. That was precisely the problem. Brenda's eyes swept over Victoria like a judge rendering verdict. The clothes, the posture, the absolute calm in the face of confrontation. Her lip curled with practiced disdain. "This is first class," Brenda snapped, wheeling toward the flight attendant as if Victoria were a piece of misplaced luggage. "I paid $15,000 for privacy and service. I will not spend 7 hours sitting next to someone who clearly wandered in from the back of the plane." The air in the cabin shifted. It always did when words like that were spoken out loud with witnesses without shame. Pressure dropped, spines stiffened. Conversations died mid-sentence. Sarah Kim, the lead flight attendant, felt the change immediately. 12 years flying international routes had taught her to read cabin dynamics the way meteorologists read storm patterns. This was a hurricane forming in real time. She forced a smile that didn't reach her tired eyes and stepped closer, her hands clasped carefully in front of her uniform. "Mrs. Morrison," she said, her voice soft but firm, "that passenger has a valid ticket for seat 1A. Your assigned seat is 1B, right here next to the window." Brenda didn't even glance at the empty seat. Her gaze remained locked on Victoria like a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. "I know exactly where my seat is supposed to be," she said, her voice dropping to that particular tone of controlled menace that rich people use when they want something fixed immediately. "What I want to know is why she is here." A man in row 2 stopped arranging his briefcase and listened without pretending not to. An older couple across the aisle leaned back slightly in their seats, missing nothing while maintaining plausible deniability. Phones shifted in lap screens, dark but ready. The modern instinct to document was already awakening. Victoria finally turned the page of her book with exaggerated slowness, then lifted her eyes. They were steady dark and completely unflinching. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice carrying the kind of calm that comes from having faced worse storms than this one. Brenda's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Yes, there's a problem. But I'm not speaking to you." She spun back toward Sarah with renewed energy. "I want to see her boarding pass right now because she absolutely does not belong in this section." Sarah felt heat creep up her neck despite the cabin's climate control. "Ma'am, she has a completely valid ticket just like you do." "Does she?" Brenda's gaze flicked over Victoria again, openly dismissive, cataloging every detail that didn't match her expectations. Did she win it in some contest? Is she airline staff getting a free upgrade? Some kind of diversity publicity stunt? Because I fly this route 4 times a year, and I have never ever seen someone like her in first class. Victoria watched Brenda with an expression that wasn't anger, wasn't fear, but something closer to profound sadness. the kind that comes from recognition from having seen this exact performance countless times before. "My ticket is completely in order," Victoria said quietly, her voice steady as bedrock. "My name is Victoria Hayes." "I don't care what your name is," Brenda snapped, volume rising as her control slipped. "I care about my comfort and my experience. I am a platinum elite member of this airline. My late husband built half the commercial real estate in Manhattan. I will not sit next to the help." The word landed like a physical blow. Sarah felt her professional smile crack and crumble. She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it as training clashed with basic human decency. Around them, the cabin had gone funeral quiet. Even the soft jazz piping through the speakers felt intrusive now. Mrs. Morrison Sarah said, her voice firmer now, finding strength in the obvious wrongness of the situation. "That language is completely unacceptable, and I cannot move a passenger who has paid for her seat. Please, take your seat, so we can complete boarding." Brenda's eyes widened with theatrical incredulity. "Did you just accuse me of discrimination? Me?" Her voice rose to a pitch that made several passengers wince. "I am the one being discriminated against here. Do you have any idea how much business my family brings to this airline? Get the supervisor. No, get the pilot. I am not sitting down until this situation is resolved to my satisfaction." Victoria exhaled slowly and closed her book, placing it carefully on the tray table with movements as precise as a tea ceremony. She folded her hands neatly in her lap and looked out the window at the rain streaking the tarmac at the gray Seattle sky, pressing down like a weighted blanket. She had seen this performance before. Different venues, different faces, but always the same underlying script. Boardrooms where she was assumed to be taking notes. Restaurants where hostesses suggested she might be more comfortable at a different establishment. Charity galas where well-meaning volunteers directed her toward the service entrance. "You really should sit down," Victoria said without turning back, her voice carrying the weight of experience. "We have a schedule to maintain." Brenda recoiled as if she'd been struck. "Do not speak to me. Do not even look at me." The cockpit door opened with a soft hydraulic hiss. Captain Luis Rodriguez stepped into the cabin, tall and broad-shouldered, his uniform crisp despite the early morning hour. At 45, silver was beginning to thread through his dark hair, and his face carried the calm authority of someone who had learned to project confidence even when turbulence hit without warning. "What seems to be the issue here?" he asked, his voice carrying the practiced neutrality of someone trained to de-escalate before situations spiraled beyond control. Brenda spun toward him like a drowning person reaching for a life preserver. "Captain, finally. Someone with actual authority. Your crew is completely refusing to do their job. This woman," she gestured toward Victoria with barely contained disgust, "is in my space. I demand she be removed immediately." Luis followed Brenda's gesture with his eyes looked at Victoria, and everything stopped. His hand froze halfway to his radio. His breath caught sharp and audible in his chest. Color drained from his face so quickly that Sarah thought for a split second he might actually faint. Recognition hit him like a physical force, 20 years of memories flooding back in an instant. Victoria turned her head slowly and met his gaze. She gave him the smallest possible nod, barely visible but unmistakable. Luis swallowed hard, his throat working visibly. Brenda noticed none of the silent exchange. She straightened triumphantly, misreading his reaction entirely. "See, even the captain can tell she doesn't belong here. She's probably using a stolen credit card or fake identification." But Luis wasn't looking at Brenda. He was looking at Victoria Hayes like a man staring at a ghost that had just spoken his name. "Victoria!" He said the word slipping out before he could stop it. The cabin felt suddenly too small, too airless. The tension was thick enough to cut. Brenda frowned, confusion creeping into her outrage. "You know her." Luis's jaw tightened. He looked back at Brenda, then at Victoria again, as if silently asking permission to proceed with something that would change everything. Brenda stepped closer, invading his personal space with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting answers. "Good. Then you know she can't possibly afford that seat. This has to be some kind of security risk. I want her identification checked. I want the police called if necessary." Victoria stood slowly. She was not tall, would never be physically imposing, but when she rose from her seat, the air itself seemed to shift around her. Her posture, straightened spine, aligned shoulders, squared with a quiet authority that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. "You want to know how I got this seat?" Victoria asked, her voice still calm, but now carrying something new underneath the surface. Brenda sneered, sensing what she thought was weakness. "I want to know why you haven't been arrested for fraud yet." "I didn't pay for this ticket," Victoria said clearly. A gasp rippled through the cabin like a wave. Several passengers leaned forward in their seats. Brenda's laugh was loud and triumphant, the sound of someone who had just won a game she'd been playing her entire life. "There it is. Did you all hear that?" She admitted it herself. She turned to Luis with vindication written all over her face. "You heard her, Captain." She confessed. "Get her off this plane immediately." Luis closed his eyes for just a second, and when he opened them, something fundamental had shifted in his expression. "I didn't pay." "Victoria," continued her voice steady and clear, "because I don't have to." She reached into her cardigan pocket and withdrew something that made the overhead lights catch and gleam. Not plastic, but metal. Matte, black, heavy, substantial. A gold chip was embedded at its center, and the airline's crest was embossed in relief across its surface. No name, no photo, no expiration date. Just authority made tangible. Luis snapped to attention without thinking, years of training and respect burned into muscle memory taking over. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth as recognition dawned. Brenda squinted at the card, confusion replacing confidence for the first time. "What is that supposed to be? Some kind of frequent flyer card?" Luis's voice shook slightly when he spoke. "That is black clearance, the highest level of authorization this airline has ever issued." Brenda waved dismissively, but there was less certainty in the gesture now. "I don't care about your little employee reward programs. She is clearly a nobody trying to scam her way into first class." Victoria looked at her, then fully and directly, 30 years of quiet observation and careful restraint settling into her gaze like armor. "Mrs. Morrison," she said, each word deliberate and measured, "you are standing on my aircraft." The cabin held its breath. The truth long buried under assumptions and appearances began to rise to the surface like air bubbles from the deep. Michael Torres, sitting in row 3, had been live-streaming his travel experience when the confrontation erupted. The tech blogger's followers on various platforms had grown from a few hundred to over 10,000 as word spread through social media. His phone was now capturing everything, and the viewer count was climbing exponentially. "Holy hell," he whispered to his camera, keeping his voice low but audible to his growing audience. "You guys are witnessing something incredible right now. I think we're about to find out this woman owns the entire airline." Jennifer Walsh, traveling with her teenage daughter to visit colleges, had started recording when Brenda's voice first rose. As a human resources director, she recognized discrimination when she saw it, and she knew documentation would be crucial. Her daughter, 16 and social media savvy, was simultaneously posting clips to TikTok with hashtags that were already starting to trend. The man in row 2 had abandoned all pretense of not watching. He held his phone steadily capturing the moment Victoria revealed the black clearance card. As a retired federal judge, he understood the legal implications of what was unfolding, and he suspected this footage would be important. Dr. Maria Santos, the civil rights attorney in row 4, had been typing furiously on her phone, providing real-time legal commentary to her Twitter followers. Her analysis of the situation was being shared thousands of times, with legal experts and civil rights organizations beginning to take notice. Brenda Morrison stood frozen in the aisle, her designer handbag hanging forgotten in her grip, staring at the small piece of metal in Victoria's hand as if it might suddenly make sense. The absolute confidence that had carried her through 48 years of getting her way was beginning to crack like ice in spring. "That's impossible," she whispered, but there was no conviction left in her voice. Victoria tilted her head slightly, a gesture both graceful and predatory. "Is it?" Luis cleared his throat, finding his voice again. "Mrs. Morrison, you are refusing crew instructions and creating a disturbance that is affecting the safety and comfort of other passengers." Brenda's head snapped toward him, disbelief curdling into desperation. "You're siding with her. I'm following federal aviation regulations," Luis replied, his captain's authority fully engaged now. "And company policy, both of which are very clear about passenger conduct." "You wouldn't dare remove me," Brenda said, but the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Victoria answered for him, her voice carrying the quiet certainty of someone who had spent decades learning exactly who everyone was. "You are a woman who believes money excuses cruelty, who thinks a ticket grants the right to diminish others, who confuses privilege with permission." Brenda lunged forward suddenly, her handbag slamming down onto the console between seats 1A and 1B with a heavy thud that echoed through the cabin like a gunshot. Sarah gasped. Several passengers flinched. Phones captured every second. "That is assault," Sarah said, her voice breaking through years of customer service training to find genuine outrage. But Brenda was beyond hearing reason now, her carefully constructed world crumbling in real time. "Check her ticket, check her ID. This is fraud." Victoria's expression hardened, not with anger, but with resolve. She stepped fully into the aisle, now standing shoulder to shoulder with Luis. The camera phones around them multiplied like flowers turning toward sunlight. 30 years ago, Victoria said, her voice carrying easily through the cabin despite its quietness, this airline had 3 aircraft and more debt than hope. Brenda scoffed, clinging to dismissal like a life raft. "I don't care about ancient history." One person didn't walk away. Victoria continued her words, cutting through Brenda's protests. She sold her home, liquidated her husband's life insurance, bought the debt outright when no investor would touch it. Luis felt his throat tighten as memories flooded back. The small office with peeling paint. The woman who had listened when everyone else walked away. The job interview that had saved his career when he thought it was over forever. She rebuilt the fleet. Victoria said, her gaze never leaving Brenda's face. Hired pilots other airlines had blacklisted for refusing to compromise safety. Created policies that treated dignity as non-negotiable. Victoria turned her head slightly, meeting Luis's eyes with the same quiet authority she had shown 20 years earlier. You remember Luis nodded, tears burning unexpectedly behind his eyes as the full weight of the moment settled over him. "Yes, ma'am." The simple words hit the cabin like thunder. Brenda's confidence faltered for the first time, visible cracks appearing in the foundation of her certainty. "What is this supposed to mean? That woman," Victoria said, her voice, unwavering, carrying the weight of 3 decades of quiet leadership, kept 51% voting control in a blind trust. No interviews, no magazine covers, no credit claimed. Brenda's mouth opened, then closed like a fish pulled from water. Her gaze darted around the cabin, searching desperately for allies, for validation, for anything solid to grasp. The faces staring back at her showed only fascination and growing horror at her behavior. "You're lying," she whispered, but the words carried no conviction. Victoria took a measured breath, and when she spoke, her voice filled the cabin with quiet authority. "I am Victoria Hayes, founder and majority shareholder of Meridian Airlines." The words landed with the force of gravity itself. The cabin didn't erupt into chaos. It froze. Complete silence settled over everything, like snow so profound that the sound of the auxiliary power unit seemed deafening by comparison. Michael Torres's live stream had now reached 40,000 viewers, with the number climbing by hundreds every few seconds. His whispered commentary had become unnecessary as the drama unfolded. Chat messages were flowing so fast he couldn't read them, but he caught glimpses. "Oh my God, plot twist, she owns the airline." This is insane. Jennifer Walsh's teenage daughter had stopped posting to TikTok and was just staring mouth open. The hashtag Victoria Hayes was beginning to trend nationally as clips from multiple angles spread across every social platform simultaneously. Dr. Maria Santos had put down her phone entirely, her legal mind reeling at the implications. This wasn't just workplace discrimination. This was a public relations catastrophe unfolding in real time with perfect documentation and a victim who had the power to respond definitively. Brenda staggered backward half a step as if physically struck. "No," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You look like—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Like what Victoria asked softly, her tone inviting honesty for perhaps the first time in the encounter. Brenda swallowed hard, finally hearing her own words reflected back at her. "Like someone who doesn't belong." Victoria nodded slowly, sadly. "Exactly. That's why you felt safe saying what you said. You looked at me and saw your assumptions confirmed. Saw what you expected to see instead of what was there." Luis straightened to his full height, his voice steady and professional when he spoke. "Mrs. Morrison, per Federal Aviation Regulation 14, CFR 121.580 and company policy, you are being denied carriage on this flight." The legal language hit Brenda like cold water. "You can't do this. This is illegal." "It's completely legal," Luis replied calmly. "Passengers who threaten the order and safety of the aircraft can be removed at the captain's discretion." Brenda's hands shook as she reached for her phone, desperation evident in every movement. "I'm calling my lawyer right now. I'll sue this airline into bankruptcy." Victoria's smile was faint and didn't reach her eyes. "Before you do that, Mrs. Morrison, you might want to consider who underwrites the insurance policies for Morrison Properties." Brenda froze her phone halfway to her ear. "Those commercial liability policies," Victoria continued conversationally, "are quite comprehensive. They include specific clauses about conduct that reflects negatively on moral character. Those contracts come up for renewal next month." The color drained from Brenda's face as the implications crashed over her. Her phone slipped from suddenly nerveless fingers clattering against the cabin floor with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud. Luis picked up the interphone with practiced calm. "Ground control. This is Flight 447. We have a non-compliant passenger situation requiring immediate assistance for removal." "You can't," Brenda whispered, looking suddenly smaller, exposed. "You wouldn't." Victoria had already returned to her seat, buckling her seatbelt with the same careful precision she had shown with everything else. She picked up her book, and the gesture was dismissive, absolute final. "You are delaying my flight," she said simply. Heavy footsteps echoed on the jet bridge moments later. 2 airport security officers boarded their presence, filling the narrow cabin doorway. Sergeant David Connor, broad-shouldered and tired but alert, scanned the situation quickly. His experienced eyes moved from Luis to Sarah to Brenda, then settled briefly on Victoria. Recognition flickered across his face. He had worked airport security for 15 years and knew exactly who owned which aircraft. He nodded once respectfully. "Ma'am," he said to Brenda, his tone professional but brooking no argument. "You'll need to gather your belongings and come with us." Brenda straightened, clinging to the last scraps of her identity like armor. "Arrest her. She's impersonating a corporate executive. This is fraud." Sergeant Connor didn't even glance at Victoria. "Ma'am, the owner of this aircraft has asked you to leave. That's all the authority we need." "You don't understand," Brenda said, her voice cracking. "I'm Brenda Morrison. My family built this city. You can't treat me like this." "I understand perfectly," Connor replied. "Now you can walk or you can be escorted. Your choice." Phone cameras were fully raised now throughout the cabin. No one pretended not to watch anymore. This was history unfolding, and everyone knew it. A woman in row 5 whispered to her companion, "This is unbelievable." An elderly man shook his head slowly, muttering something about respect and dignity. Brenda's shoulders sagged as the reality of her situation finally penetrated her shock. The rage collapsed into humiliation, then something approaching panic. She grabbed her designer handbag with trembling hands and allowed herself to be guided toward the aircraft door. As she passed through the cabin, a slow clap began. One person, then another, then dozens. The sound filled the space that Brenda had once tried to claim as exclusively hers. She walked through it without looking back, her head down, her whole world crashing around her with each step. The aircraft door closed behind her with a final echoing thud that seemed to seal more than just the cabin. It sealed the end of a performance that had been running for 48 years. Luis exhaled for what felt like the first time in minutes. He picked up the interphone again, his voice steady and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We'll be departing shortly." Applause broke out again, softer this time, reverent rather than triumphant. Sarah approached Victoria, her hands still trembling slightly from adrenaline and the aftershock of witnessing something she would never forget. "Ms. Hayes," she said quietly, "would you like anything to drink?" Victoria looked up from her book and smiled. For the first time since the confrontation began, the expression reached her eyes. It was warm, human, transformative. "That would be lovely, Sarah. Just coffee, please." "Of course, ma'am." Outside, rain continued to streak down the aircraft windows as the plane pushed back from the gate. Brenda Morrison stood in the terminal alone and diminished, watching the aircraft that had rejected her taxi toward the runway. Her reflection in the terminal windows looked back at her like a stranger. But inside the aircraft, as it lifted through the gray Seattle clouds, Victoria Hayes sat calmly in seat 1. Her book open but unread, watching the world shrink below. She was exactly where she had always belonged, and for the first time in years, everyone else knew it too. By the time Flight 447 reached cruising altitude, the digital wildfire below had already consumed 3 continents. Victoria Hayes's name was trending globally on every major social platform, but she remained absorbed in her paperback novel, occasionally glancing out the window at the endless blue sky that had become her second home over 3 decades of flying. Her phone buzzed insistently in her cardigan pocket. Text after text, call after call, the outside world demanding her attention. She let it buzz. Sarah Kim approached with a crystal glass of champagne despite Victoria having requested only coffee. "Compliments of the entire crew," Sarah said softly. "We wanted to thank you." Victoria looked up, surprised. "Thank me for what?" "For showing us what dignity looks like under pressure," Sarah replied. "For proving that respect isn't negotiable. You've been respectful to every passenger who's ever boarded this aircraft," Victoria said, accepting the glass. "That's exactly what you should do. I just happen to have the authority to enforce it when others won't." Meanwhile, on the ground at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, Brenda Morrison sat alone on a hard plastic bench, still clutching her designer handbag like armor that no longer fit properly. The terminal buzzed with normal travel energy around her families heading on vacation. Business travelers checking phones, the endless dance of departure and arrival that never stopped, never cared about individual drama. Her phone had finally stopped ringing, not because people had stopped calling, but because she had turned it off entirely. The first few voicemails had been from her attorney, his voice growing progressively more strained with each message. The subsequent calls had come from business associates, board members, even her country club's social director, all asking the same question. What the hell happened? She knew what had happened. She had revealed who she really was in front of cameras, witnesses, and the owner of the company she had tried to humiliate. The videos were everywhere now. She had seen them before turning off her phone. Her voice sharp and ugly, demanding someone's removal based on nothing but appearance and assumption. 35,000 feet above Michael Torres was ending his live stream, but continuing to monitor the explosion of responses across social media. His follower count had tripled in 2 hours. News outlets were reaching out for interview requests. The hashtag Victoria Hayes was trending alongside Dignity Matters and Know Who You're Insulting. "This is bigger than airline drama?" he whispered to his camera during his final sign-off. "This is about every time someone has been made to feel small because of how they look, where they come from, or who someone assumes they are. And it's about what happens when quiet power finally speaks up." Dr. Maria Santos had abandoned any pretense of doing other work. As a civil rights attorney, she understood the legal implications unfolding in real time. Discrimination cases usually played out in closed courtrooms with limited public attention. This one had been documented from every angle by dozens of witnesses, with the perpetrator making explicitly prejudicial statements that were now preserved forever in digital amber. In the cockpit, Luis Rodriguez maintained steady communication with air traffic control while processing the emotional weight of what had just transpired. His co-pilot, James Patterson, finally broke the professional silence. "Skip, can I ask what that was about? I've never seen you look like that." Luis considered how much to share, then decided the truth was simpler than any explanation he could construct. "That woman in 1A saved my career 20 years ago. I was young, idealistic, refused to fly a plane with a faulty navigation system. Got blacklisted by every major airline for being difficult. Meridian hired you? Victoria Hayes hired me personally. Sat in a conference room that smelled like old coffee and listened while I explained why safety couldn't be negotiated. Gave me a job when no one else would return my calls. Built this entire company on the principle that doing the right thing matters more than doing the easy thing." James absorbed this information quietly. "And the passenger who got removed just learned what happens when you mistake quiet strength for weakness." Luis replied, "Ms. Hayes has spent 30 years building an airline where everyone gets treated with respect. She wasn't about to let someone turn her own aircraft into an exception." Back in the cabin, Victoria's phone had finally gone silent. She pulled it from her pocket and glanced at the screen. 47 missed calls, over 200 text messages. She scrolled through a few sender names, her assistant, her legal team reporters from major publications, government officials, civil rights organizations. One name caught her attention: Marcus Rivera, CEO of Morrison Properties. Brenda's stepson, who had taken over the family business after his stepmother's husband died. Victoria had met him twice at industry functions. Quiet, competent. Nothing like his stepmother. His text was brief. "Ms. Hayes, I sincerely apologize for Brenda's behavior. She speaks for herself, not our company. I hope we can discuss this when you're available." Victoria typed back, "Marcus, thank you for reaching out. Your stepmother made her choices. You shouldn't have to apologize for someone else's character. We'll talk soon." She put the phone away and returned to her book, but her mind wasn't on the story anymore. She was thinking about consequences, about the ripple effects that would spread from this moment like circles on water. The aircraft began its initial descent toward their destination 3 hours later. Victoria had finally finished her book and was looking out the window at the sprawling cityscape below when Sarah approached one more time. "Ms. Hayes, there are news crews waiting at the gate." Victoria nodded. "I expected as much. Would you like us to arrange alternative deplaning?" "No," Victoria said firmly. "I've been invisible long enough. It's time to answer some questions." as Flight 447 touched down smoothly on the runway. Passengers began gathering their belongings with the usual pre-arrival energy. But there was something different in the cabin's atmosphere, an electric sense that they had all been part of something significant. The aircraft rolled to a stop at the gate, and Victoria Hayes prepared to step off her own plane and into a conversation the entire world was waiting to hear. 26 years earlier, Victoria Hayes sat across from a loan officer whose nameplate read Robert Sterling in brass letters that caught the fluorescent light like a warning. The Commerce National Bank office smelled of carpet cleaner and disappointment, decorated with motivational posters that somehow made the rejection feel more personal. Mrs. Hayes Roberts said, not looking up from her application, "I have to be frank with you. This request is highly unusual." Victoria kept her hands folded in her lap, wedding ring still feeling foreign after 3 months of marriage. James had insisted she use his name for the business loan, thinking it might help. They were both learning how naive that assumption had been. Unusual how she asked, though she already knew the answer. A woman wanting to purchase a failing airline. Robert finally looked at her, his expression mixing condescension with genuine bewilderment. With no experience in aviation management, using life insurance money from a recent accident, he shook his head slowly. "I just don't see how we can justify this level of risk." Victoria had heard variations of this conversation 6 times in the past month. Different banks, different loan officers, same underlying message. People like you don't own airlines. "Mr. Sterling," she said carefully, "I have a master's in business administration from Stanford, 15 years of experience in logistics management, and a comprehensive business plan that your own analysis department called remarkably thorough. What additional qualifications would make this less risky?" Robert shuffled papers unnecessarily. "Well, it's not just qualifications. It's practical considerations. The aviation industry is extremely demanding, highly regulated. These aren't businesses you can run from home between other responsibilities. Other responsibilities? You know, family obligations. Women often find that business ownership conflicts with..." He gestured vaguely, as if the rest of the sentence was too obvious to speak aloud. Victoria felt something harden in her chest, crystallizing into resolve. She had buried her husband 3 months earlier after a drunk driver ran a red light. The life insurance settlement sat in her bank account like a monument to shattered plans and unfinished dreams. James had been the dreamer. She had been the practical one. Now she was both. "Mr. Sterling," she said, leaning forward slightly, "my husband died believing we could build something better than what exists, something that treats people with dignity regardless of who they are or what they look like. I'm going to honor that vision with or without your bank's support. Mrs. Hayes, I understand grief can make people want to take dramatic action, but this isn't grief." Victoria interrupted, her voice steady as bedrock. "This is business. Good business, and you're making a mistake." She gathered her papers, stood, and walked out of Commerce National Bank for the last time. By the end of the week, she had liquidated every asset she and James had accumulated, sold their house, cashed out retirement accounts, and bought the debt of Meridian Airlines outright. The company she purchased consisted of 3 aging aircraft, 47 employees, and enough debt to sink a considerably larger operation. The previous owner, Frank Morrison, Brenda's father-in-law, had built his fortune in real estate and treated the airline like an expensive hobby that had stopped being fun. Victoria's first day as owner was spent in a hangar that smelled of jet fuel and broken dreams. The maintenance crew looked at her with barely concealed skepticism. The pilots acted like they were already planning their exit strategies. The flight attendants whispered among themselves about how long they thought the new owner would last. She called everyone together in the largest hangar standing beneath the wing of a Boeing 737 that had seen better decades. "I know what you're thinking," she began, her voice carrying clearly in the cavernous space. "You're wondering who this woman is, and how long before she realizes she's made a terrible mistake." Uncomfortable laughter rippled through the group. You're wondering if your jobs are safe, if your benefits will continue, if this company will still exist next month. Victoria paused, making eye contact with as many faces as she could. I'm here to answer those questions. She pulled out a sheet of paper, her entire business plan condensed to one page of commitments. First, no layoffs for the first year regardless of financial pressure. Second, safety is non-negotiable, even if it costs us money. Third, every employee gets treated with respect, and every passenger gets treated like they belong here. A maintenance supervisor named Joe raised his hand. What if we can't make money with those rules? Victoria smiled. Then we'll figure out how to change the business, not the rules. That was where Luis Rodriguez came in 6 months later. Luis had been 25 years old and already blacklisted by 3 major airlines for his refusal to sign off on aircraft he considered unsafe. His reputation in the industry was difficult, inflexible, and too idealistic for commercial aviation. He sat across from Victoria in her cramped office, resume in hand, expecting another polite rejection. Instead, she asked him about the incidents that had ended his previous jobs. "Tell me about the navigation system," she said. Luis straightened, surprised. Most interviewers avoided discussing his problem behavior. The inertial guidance unit was failing intermittently. Sometimes it worked fine, sometimes it gave false readings. The maintenance chief said it was within acceptable parameters for continued operation. But acceptable parameters for continued operation isn't the same as safe for passengers. I refuse to fly with unreliable navigation, especially on routes over water. Victoria nodded. And the engine mount issue at your previous airline, hairline stress fractures that were documented but considered non-critical. I disagreed with that assessment. Why? Luis looked at her carefully, trying to read her expression. Because non-critical failures can become critical failures at 30,000 feet. Because passengers trust us with their lives, and that trust is sacred. Victoria had heard enough. Captain Rodriguez, how would you like to help me build an airline where safety doesn't have to compete with profit margins? That conversation had taken place 20 years ago. Now, as Flight 447 cruised toward its destination, Luis smiled at the memory. Victoria Hayes had kept every promise she had made that day in the hangar. No layoffs during the financial struggles of the first years. Safety as the highest priority, even when it meant costly delays and maintenance. Respect as a company policy, not just a suggestion. She had also kept promises she hadn't made explicitly, but that had become part of Meridian's DNA. When Maria Santos was hired as their first Latina captain, Victoria had personally walked her through the aircraft to make sure every crew member understood that respect wasn't optional. When David Kim became their first Asian American executive pilot, Victoria had made sure he knew he could report any problems directly to her. She had built more than an airline. She had built a culture. The business grew steadily but never dramatically. Victoria refused the kind of leveraged expansion that destroyed so many airlines in the 1990s and 2000s. She reinvested profits into better aircraft, more training, higher wages, and improved passenger experience. When other airlines cut services to maximize quarterly earnings, Meridian maintained standards that cost money but built loyalty. By 2010, Meridian Airlines had grown to 47 aircraft, over 3,000 employees, and a reputation as the airline that treated everyone like first-class passengers. Industry analysts called it a niche strategy that couldn't scale. Victoria called it the only strategy that mattered. She had faced discrimination throughout those decades, but it had evolved from the overt rejections of her early years to more subtle forms. Meetings where her ideas were credited to male colleagues. Industry conferences where she was introduced as James Hayes's widow rather than Meridian's CEO. Charity events where organizers assumed she was there in a support role rather than as a major donor. Each incident had taught her something about power, visibility, and the strategic value of being underestimated. She learned to use assumptions as camouflage to let people reveal their prejudices before revealing her authority. It was a survival strategy that worked brilliantly in business, but exacted a personal cost she rarely acknowledged. The incident with Brenda Morrison wasn't the first time someone had questioned her presence in first class. It happened regularly enough that Victoria had developed standard responses: show the ticket, calmly ignore the looks, let the assumptions pass without correction. She had trained herself to be invisible in plain sight. But something had been different this morning. Maybe it was the sheer arrogance of Brenda's demands. Maybe it was the presence of cameras that would preserve the moment forever. Maybe it was simply that Victoria Hayes had grown tired of being invisible on her own aircraft. The first domino fell while Brenda Morrison was still sitting on the airport bench, staring at her reflection in the black screen of her silenced phone. She didn't know that Marcus Rivera, her stepson and CEO of Morrison Properties, was in an emergency board meeting 3,000 miles away, watching the viral video for the 7th time with the company's entire executive team. "How bad is this?" asked Jennifer Martinez, the company's legal counsel, her fingers already flying across her laptop as she researched liability implications. Marcus paused the video. At the moment, Brenda slammed her handbag down on the aircraft console. "Legally, we might be able to contain it since she wasn't representing the company. Financially, we're about to find out who our insurance carriers really are." "What do you mean?" asked the CFO, David Park. "Victoria Hayes owns Meridian Airlines, but her investment portfolio through Blackstone Capital includes significant stakes in Pinnacle Insurance Group and Metropolitan Underwriters. Between those two companies, they handle about 60% of our commercial liability coverage." The room went silent as the implications sank in. "Our policies are up for renewal in 4 weeks, Jennifer said quietly. "And behavior clauses are standard in commercial insurance now," Marcus replied, reaching for his phone. "I need to call her immediately." But Victoria Hayes wasn't answering her phone. She was 35,000 feet above the Pacific, strategically unreachable, while her team implemented a response plan they had hoped never to use. Elena Vasquez sat in Meridian's corporate headquarters, managing what could only be described as controlled chaos. The main conference room had been converted into a war room with multiple screens showing social media feeds, news coverage, and real-time analytics. Update Elena said to her assembled team. "Video has been viewed over 2 million times across all platforms," reported David Chen, head of digital communications. Hashtag Victoria Hayes is trending in 8 countries. News coverage is universally positive for us, universally negative for Morrison. Legal implications. Clean, said attorney Rachel Goldman. Morrison made discriminatory statements in front of multiple witnesses, was removed for disruptive behavior under federal aviation regulations, and was never subjected to anything beyond standard enforcement procedures. If anything, we exercised unusual restraint. Back at the airport, Brenda finally turned her phone back on. The barrage of notifications crashed over her like a digital tsunami. Missed calls from her attorney, her accountant, board members from 3 different charity organizations, her social circle, and dozens of reporters whose numbers she didn't recognize. She listened to the first voicemail from her attorney, Thomas Brennan. "Brenda, call me immediately. The video is everywhere, and we need to discuss immediate damage control. Do not speak to any reporters. Do not post anything on social media. Call me now." The third message, left 20 minutes ago, was barely controlled. "Panic, Brenda. I've been contacted by representatives from Victoria Hayes. They want to schedule a call about your insurance coverage. This is serious. Whatever you're doing, stop and call me immediately." Brenda's hands shook as she dialed his number. "Thomas." "It's Brenda. I just got your messages. What's happening?" "What's happening is that you decided to commit career suicide on camera," Thomas said without preamble. "Brenda, do you understand who Victoria Hayes is? Some woman who owns an airline. Some woman who owns significant stakes in the companies that insure your business, your properties, and your liability exposure. Some woman who can destroy you financially without breaking a single law." Brenda felt the blood drain from her face. "That's not possible. It's not only possible, it's happening right now. Pinnacle Insurance is reviewing your commercial liability policy. Metropolitan is reviewing your directors' and officers' coverage. Those policies have morality clauses that specifically address conduct that reflects negatively on character and judgment. But I wasn't representing the company, Brenda. You screamed at a black woman in first class and demanded her removal based on racial assumptions. It doesn't matter what company you were representing, it matters what kind of person you revealed yourself to be. The truth was hitting Brenda in waves, each realization worse than the last. Can they really cancel my insurance? They can refuse to renew it. And in the current market, if Pinnacle and Metropolitan decline renewal, good luck finding replacement coverage at anything approaching reasonable rates. 3 hours later, Marcus Rivera's call finally went through to Victoria Hayes. She was in the airport VIP lounge preparing for the press conference that would define the next phase of her career. Ms. Hayes, this is Marcus Rivera. I believe you know why I'm calling. I do, Victoria replied. How are you, Marcus? I heard good things about the sustainable development project you completed in Brooklyn. Marcus was surprised by her calm, personal tone. He had expected corporate warfare. Instead, he was getting a conversation. Thank you. Ms. Hayes, I need to address what happened today. You don't need to apologize for your stepmother's behavior, Victoria said. Adults are responsible for their own choices. I appreciate that, but I'm calling about the business implications. Morrison Properties employs 800 people. Most of them had nothing to do with what happened today. Victoria was quiet for a moment. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that whatever consequences Brenda faces personally, they don't have to destroy the livelihoods of people who had no role in her decisions. Marcus, I'm not trying to destroy anyone's livelihood. I'm simply not going to subsidize discrimination by providing insurance coverage to people who demonstrate that kind of judgment. What if Brenda was no longer involved in the company? Another pause. Victoria was considering something Marcus couldn't see. What does your board structure look like? Brenda holds 30% voting shares inherited from my father. I hold 40%. The remaining 30% is distributed among other family members and employees. And if her shares were diluted or transferred, the company could continue operating exactly as it has, but with different leadership oversight. Victoria made her decision. Marcus, I'm going to give you 48 hours to restructure your ownership and leadership in a way that removes Brenda from any operational or strategic role. If you can do that, and if the company commits to diversity and inclusion policies that actually matter, then the insurance situation becomes much more manageable. And if we can't, then you'll discover what market rates look like for companies associated with documented discrimination, Victoria replied. Marcus, I don't want to hurt innocent people, but I also won't pretend that what happened today was acceptable. After the call ended, Marcus stared at his phone for a long moment, then called an emergency board meeting. Brenda's behavior had just forced the family to choose between her and the business that employed hundreds of people. The choice was easier than it should have been. By the time Victoria Hayes stepped up to the podium for her press conference, 6 hours later, Brenda Morrison had already been removed from all operational roles at Morrison Properties. Her ownership stake had been bought out by the company at fair market value. Her board positions with 3 charities had been terminated, and her membership at the Manhattan Country Club was under formal review. She sat alone in a hotel room she had paid for with her last functioning credit card, watching Victoria Hayes address a room full of reporters with the same quiet authority she had shown on the airplane. The press conference lasted exactly 47 minutes, but Victoria Hayes knew its effects would ripple outward for years. She stood behind the podium with the same calm presence she had maintained throughout the flight, fielding questions with the precision of someone who had spent 30 years thinking carefully about every word. Ms. Hayes called out a reporter from CNN. You've built a successful airline while maintaining relative anonymity. Why reveal yourself now? Victoria considered the question, her hands resting lightly on the podium. because anonymity becomes complicity when it allows discrimination to flourish unchallenged. I've spent 3 decades proving that businesses can succeed while treating everyone with dignity. Today seemed like the right time to make that philosophy more visible. What changes do you plan to implement industry-wide? We're launching the Meridian Standard Victoria, announced, revealing the initiative her team had been developing for months. It's a comprehensive framework for eliminating bias in transportation services. Real-time reporting systems, mandatory bias training, clear accountability measures, and transparent consequences for discriminatory behavior. She gestured to Elena, who distributed information packets to the assembled journalists. The standard will be implemented across all Meridian operations within 60 days. We're also making it freely available to any transportation company committed to meaningful change. Airlines, bus companies, cruise lines, ride-share services, anyone who wants to prove that respect is standard operating procedure. The questions continued for another 20 minutes, covering implementation timelines, legal frameworks, and industry resistance. Victoria answered each one with the measured confidence of someone who had been thinking about these solutions for decades. Finally, a young reporter from a digital news outlet asked the question. Victoria had been waiting for Ms. Hayes. "What do you want people to remember about today?" Victoria stepped slightly closer to the microphones, her voice carrying the weight of personal experience. "I want them to remember that assumptions are dangerous, that dignity isn't determined by appearance, wealth, or social status, and that real power isn't about silencing others, it's about amplifying voices that deserve to be heard." She paused, looking directly into the cameras that would carry her words around the world. "Most importantly, I want people to understand that change doesn't require dramatic gestures or viral moments. It requires consistent choices day after day to treat every human being as worthy of respect. That's not revolutionary. It's basic decency. But apparently, basic decency is revolutionary enough." As Victoria left the podium, Elena handed her a tablet showing real-time analytics. The Meridian Standard announcement was trending globally. Transportation companies across 6 countries were already requesting information about implementation. Civil rights organizations were offering partnerships. Government officials were scheduling meetings to discuss federal policy implications. Ma'am Elena said quietly, "We've received over 300 media requests in the last hour, including interview requests from 60 Minutes Good Morning America and the BBC." Victoria nodded. "Schedule them strategically. I want to reach the broadest possible audience, but the message needs to stay consistent. This isn't about personal vindication. It's about building infrastructure for change." 6 months after the incident, Victoria received an unexpected visitor at her office. Marcus Rivera had requested the meeting through official channels, but she was surprised when he arrived with a portfolio under his arm and genuine remorse in his eyes. "Ms. Hayes, thank you for seeing me," Marcus said, settling into the chair across from her desk. "I wanted to update you on Morrison Properties and discuss a proposal." Victoria gestured for him to continue. "Since restructuring the company, we've implemented comprehensive diversity and inclusion policies. Mandatory bias training for all employees, diverse hiring practices, community outreach programs. We've also partnered with local organizations to provide affordable housing in neighborhoods where people of color have been historically excluded." "That's excellent progress," Victoria said. "How are the insurance situations working out?" Marcus smiled ruefully. "Expensive lesson learned, but manageable. The new policies actually cost less than the old ones because our risk profile improved with better management practices." He opened his portfolio and pulled out a thick document. "Which brings me to my proposal. We want to establish the Hayes Foundation for Transportation Equity, a $50 million endowment focused on eliminating bias across all forms of public and private transportation." Victoria raised an eyebrow. "Why involve my name?" "Because you've proven that business success and social justice aren't mutually exclusive," Marcus replied. And because the Foundation's work should be associated with someone who understands both the moral imperative and the practical implementation of change. Victoria reviewed the proposal quietly. The Foundation would fund research, training, technology development, and legal support for discrimination victims. It would work with companies willing to change and hold accountable those that refused. Marcus, this is thoughtful and comprehensive. But why are you doing this? Honestly, because watching my stepmother's behavior made me realize how much injustice I'd been willing to tolerate as long as it didn't affect me personally. This is how I make amends for 30 years of looking the other way. Victoria closed the folder and looked at him directly. I accept your proposal with one modification. The Foundation should be called the Transportation Equity Initiative. This work is bigger than any individual name. As Marcus prepared to leave, Victoria walked him to the door. How is Brenda doing? Marcus hesitated. She's struggling. Lost most of her social circle dealing with significant financial pressures. She started working with a nonprofit that helps people transition out of homelessness. Volunteer work, entry-level case management, minimum wage direct service. It's been humbling for her from what I understand. Victoria nodded. Sometimes consequences become opportunities. Maybe she'll learn something about dignity from people who've had theirs challenged in different ways. 1 year later, Victoria Hayes walked through Seattle-Tacoma International Airport with the same unhurried pace she had always maintained, but the world around her had changed in ways both subtle and profound. She wore the same type of simple cardigan, carried the same worn paperback book, but passengers who recognized her nodded with genuine respect rather than confusion about her presence. Flight 447 to Los Angeles was boarding as she approached Gate B12. Sarah Kim stood at the counter now wearing the additional stripes of a senior flight attendant supervisor, her smile bright and unforced as she scanned boarding passes and welcomed passengers aboard. Ms. Hayes, Sarah said warmly, welcome aboard. Your usual seat is ready. Thank you, Sarah. How's the new training program working out? Remarkable results, Sarah replied. We haven't had a single discrimination incident in 8 months. The de-escalation techniques are helping with everything from seating disputes to luggage disagreements. Turns out treating people with respect prevents most problems before they start. Victoria smiled. Revolutionary concept. She settled into seat 1A as other passengers filed past. A young black woman in business attire took seat 1B, pulling out a laptop and immediately diving into work. An elderly Latino man settled across the aisle with his granddaughter who was excitedly pointing out the window at aircraft taxiing on the runway. A Muslim family found their seats in economy, the mother adjusting her headscarf as the flight attendant helped store their carry-on luggage with genuine courtesy. Luis Rodriguez's voice came over the intercom, warm and professional. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is Captain Rodriguez. We're expecting smooth skies today with an on-time arrival in Los Angeles. As always, our crew is committed to ensuring every passenger feels welcomed and respected throughout the flight. Sit back, relax, and thank you for choosing Meridian Airlines. Victoria opened her book but found herself watching the cabin instead of reading. The atmosphere was different from what she remembered from years past, more relaxed, more inclusive. Passengers chatted easily across ethnic and economic lines. Flight attendants moved through the space with genuine warmth rather than forced politeness. A young white man in row 3 looked uncomfortable as an elderly black woman struggled to lift her bag into the overhead compartment. Victoria watched carefully, wondering if old patterns would reassert themselves. Instead, the man immediately stood and helped with the bag, then offered the woman his aisle seat when he noticed she was having difficulty with her knees. "Thank you, sweetheart," the woman said. "That's very kind." "My grandmother has arthritis too," he replied. "I know how hard those middle seats can be." They switched seats without drama, without resentment, with simple human kindness. Victoria felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized was still tightly wound. Her phone buzzed with a text from Elena Foundation report is ready for your review. Transportation Equity Initiative now working with 347 companies across 23 countries. Discrimination incidents down 67% where the standard has been fully implemented. Another text, this one from Marcus Rivera. Brenda finished her case management certification program. She's asked if she can schedule a meeting with you. No pressure, just wanted you to know. Victoria stared at that message for a long moment. She had wondered occasionally what had become of the woman whose moment of revealed prejudice had sparked this entire transformation. Part of her was curious. Part of her felt that some conversations were unnecessary. She typed back, "Let me think about it." As the plane reached cruising altitude, Victoria finally opened her book. It was a biography of Dorothy Height, the civil rights leader who had spent decades working for change with quiet persistence rather than dramatic gestures. Victoria had been drawn to Height's story because it reflected her own approach, sustained effort over flashy moments building infrastructure rather than seeking spotlights. A flight attendant approached with the drink service. Not Sarah, but a young man Victoria didn't recognize. "Ms. Hayes, what can I get for you today?" "Just coffee, please." "Black. Absolutely. And ma'am, I wanted to say thank you for everything you've done. My brother is gay and he used to hate flying because of how some airlines treated same-sex couples. Now he actually looks forward to travel." Victoria looked up at him. Really looked. He was maybe 25, earnest grateful in a way that suggested personal experience with discrimination. "What's your name?" she asked. "David Martinez." "David, thank you for sharing that. Your brother's comfort and safety matter. Everyone's does." "Yes, ma'am. That's why I wanted to work for Meridian. It's not just a job here. It's a mission." After he moved on, Victoria reflected on the phrase, "it's a mission." That was exactly what she had hoped to create workplaces where employees understood they were part of something larger than customer service, where dignity was a shared responsibility rather than a corporate slogan. The young woman in 1B closed her laptop and turned slightly toward Victoria. "Excuse me, are you Victoria Hayes?" Victoria nodded. "I'm Angela Thompson. I work for a tech company in Los Angeles, and we've implemented your standard across our entire corporate travel program. I wanted to thank you personally." "What kind of difference has it made?" "Huge. Our employees, especially the women and people of color, actually trust that business travel will be respectful now. Productivity is up because people aren't stressed about being mistreated in transit. Seems obvious in retrospect, but no one was measuring the cost of discrimination until you proved it was measurable." Victoria smiled. "Business case for decency." "Exactly. You made moral arguments that accountants could understand." As their conversation continued, Victoria realized this was what success looked like, young professionals who took respectful treatment for granted because it had become standard operating procedure. Not a pleasant surprise. The plane began its descent toward Los Angeles as the sun set over the Pacific, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Victoria looked out at the sprawling city below, thinking about the millions of people down there who would travel tomorrow, next week, next year. How many of them would have better experiences because of policies that had grown from one moment of revealed prejudice? Luis's voice came over the intercom again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent into Los Angeles. Thank you for flying with us today, and remember, wherever your travels take you next, you deserve to be treated with dignity and respect." It was a small addition to the standard arrival announcement, but Victoria heard the intentionality behind it. A reminder that passenger rights extended beyond this aircraft, this airline, this moment. As they touched down smoothly on the runway, spontaneous applause broke out in the cabin. Not for the landing, which had been routine, but for something harder to define. Maybe for the flight attendants who had made everyone feel welcome. Maybe for the passengers who had chosen kindness over indifference. Maybe for the simple fact that human beings could share space peacefully when dignity was the default. Victoria gathered her things slowly in no hurry to deplane. She watched families reunite in the aisles, business travelers check their phones, elderly passengers take their time standing up without anyone rushing them. She watched humanity being decent to itself, which was still remarkable enough to feel miraculous. Sarah appeared at her elbow. "Ms. Hayes, there's a car waiting for you, but no rush. Take your time." "Sarah, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you remember what it felt like before? When discrimination was just normal?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "It feels like remembering a nightmare. You know it was real, but it's hard to believe you lived through it. Now, when I see old videos of passengers being mistreated, it looks barbaric, like footage from a different civilization." Victoria nodded. That was exactly right. They had changed not just policies, but expectations. Not just procedures, but possibilities. As she walked up the jet bridge, Victoria thought about Brenda Morrison's request for a meeting. Maybe it was time for that conversation. Not because she owed Brenda anything, but because completing circles sometimes mattered more than keeping them open. She pulled out her phone and texted Marcus. "I'll meet with her. 1 hour, neutral location, no media. She talks, I listen. After that, we all move forward." The terminal buzzed with typical evening energy as Victoria made her way toward the exit. Travelers hurried past, focused on connections and destinations. Most didn't recognize her, which was exactly how she preferred it. The work was public now. She could remain private. But as she reached the door to ground transportation, a little girl broke away from her family and ran up to Victoria. "Are you the airplane lady?" she asked in Spanish-accented English. Victoria knelt to the child's eye level. "I work with airplanes, yes. My mama says you made it so people can't be mean to us when we fly." Victoria's throat tightened unexpectedly. "Your mama is right. Everyone deserves to be treated nicely when they travel." The little girl hugged her quickly, then ran back to her family. Her mother smiled and nodded gratefully from across the terminal. Victoria stood and walked into the Los Angeles evening, carrying 30 years of quiet work and 1 moment of life-changing visibility toward whatever came next. The world was different now. Not perfect, but better. Not finished, but farther along. And somewhere in that progress, a woman who had once demanded someone's removal from a seat had learned to serve people whose dignity she was still discovering how to recognize. The circle wasn't closed, but it was closing. And that was enough. If this story moved you, remember that change starts with each of us. Every time we choose respect over prejudice, kindness over cruelty, we build a better world. Hit that like button if you believe dignity should be the standard everywhere we go. Subscribe for more stories about justice, courage, and the power of doing what's right. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that their voice matters and their presence belongs in every space they rightfully occupy. Because when we stand up for each other, we all rise together. When we refuse to let discrimination hide in silence, we create a world where everyone can travel, work, and live with the respect they deserve. Stay strong, stay kind, and remember that real power isn't about putting others down. It's about lifting everyone up until dignity becomes so normal that stories like this one are no longer necessary. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.